When did your "we need to get out now" feeling save you? Story 1. There's been a few times where I hadn't listened to my gut, but one sticks out where I did. I used to live in a smaller Minnesotan town down near some train tracks and a bike/running path that extends out of town into the woods. One evening I'm sitting outside on my porch drinking a couple of beers with my buddy. Two dudes walk up on us kind of out of nowhere, and immediately something seemed off with them. It's a college town, and drunk people come up onto your porch a lot or randomly just say hello on their way to or from the bars downtown. But these dudes had a badass vibe to them. I had a little black Louisville Slugger lying next to me on the porch, so I grabbed and just held it across my lap. One dude asks us, "You guys got an extra smoke?" Buddy says nope. The other guy comes up real close almost onto the porch and says, "Did you see my face?" I just kept looking forward but not directly at him, and just said, "Nah man, we didn't see anything." He said something like, "Good, lil punk ass," and they both walked away. 2 nights later, I'm sitting in my living room with the same buddy, and the local news is on. 2 guys arrested for robbing and stabbing a man a couple nights back on the trail down by the train tracks next to where I live. My buddy had looked at their faces coming up, and I had seen the dude clear as day that had asked for the smoke. It was those same fucking guys. Story 2. I woke up at 3 a.m. once sitting upright in bed. I felt on alert and my heart raced when I saw that my cat was on alert too, wide awake by my feet with his ears perked up. But I didn't see or hear anything weird. Something didn't feel right, and I couldn't relax. So I got up and went to the kitchen, turned on some lights, and ate food even though I wasn't that hungry. Eventually went back to bed. We discovered the next morning that someone had stopped while in the process of using some kind of tool to silently cut a big hole in the glass window in the living room. They were trying to break in, right next to the bedroom. I think the lights I turned on scared them away. We had 3 long years of issues with our neighbors. They repeatedly came into our property and were pissed that we put up a 9-foot fence to keep them out. This attempted break-in happened right after the fence went up and 2 days before they all moved out. Glad those pieces of shit are long gone. Story 3. While I was walking home, wasn't late and I'm from a pretty safe area, but it was that time of year when it starts to get dark really early, so felt kind of ominous. Anyway, I passed this guy in a red sweater and red tracksuit bottoms, and he looks at me funny. Maybe he's high, maybe he's drunk. Either way, something not quite right about him. I keep going. Look behind me, he's still there. Cross the road. He crosses with me. As soon as I turn a corner, I sprint to my apartment complex and run into the coded gate and wait. He rocks up a minute later and stares at me through the gate. He just stares at me for a good 10 or so seconds, then runs back the way he came. Shivers. Story 4. I'm a firefighter. We got called out to a tree fire started by fallen power lines. We pull up in the truck, and I'm trusting that my driver and crew leader are doing their job and have good situational awareness. We get out of the truck, and we've parked next to a set of power lines, not fallen. It's a very windy night, and I can see the lines swinging, so I voice my concerns to my crew leader, who says it'll be fine. We get out, hose out, risk of the tree fire catching onto a house outweighing potential risk of arcing plus the line disconnected when it fell. And I'm on the branch ready to start putting it out with 2 others near me when I get a chill. I look up, see the lines swinging violently, and yell, "Everyone fucking move." As the 3 of us sprint and dive out of the way, we hear a thwip and crack, and sure enough the line we were under came loose and stayed connected to the power pole. If I hadn't got that chill, chances are we would have had 3 fried fireys. Story 5. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. It's one of many, but this one stands out. I'm about 7, my neighbor's 8 and 9, and we're at a bus stop. Guy in stereotypical white van pulls up and asks if we've seen a dog. He doesn't describe the dog, and the truth is, dogs ran around in our neighborhood. My mother taught me stranger danger since as long as I can remember. So one of the boys at the stop, we'll call him Paul. Paul describes a dog, and man in van is like, "That's my dog, why don't you get inside the van, we can all go look for him." Well, I had red flags going off at this point, and said, "No, I have to ask my mother," and as soon as those words left my mouth, he peeled out. It was only later that I realized I saved us all from child abduction, specifically Paul, who was walking toward the van to get in. Teach your kids what to do if this situation happens. Get the license plate, the guy's face, the car type, and what to do if something does happen. If I had known to snag his plates, we might have had a chance at catching him, but I only knew to say no. Another time I was speeding down a hill and thought, What if there's a deer around the corner? So I slowed down and sure enough, there were 3 deer in the road. Saved my own life by a rando thought. Story 6. Some dude get off the bus at the same stop as me. It's about 8 p.m. in October, so it's quite dark out already. He had spoken to me on the bus, one line about nice weather. Anyway, he gets off the bus after me. I cross the road and make a mental note of him walking the opposite way to me. I make sure to watch him walking away. Something in my gut says not to trust him. To get to my house, I have to walk up a hill with a path alongside a high stone wall. It is secluded. Usually I listen to music as I walk. I decide not to this time. I'm about halfway up when I get this awful feeling. I take out my phone, dial my mother's number, and as I do I hear fast steps of someone running up behind me. I know it's the guy before I turn around, and as I do he is literally running full speed towards me. I look him dead in the eyes, ready to fight for my life. As I do this, my mother answers her phone, and I say, "Hi, Mom." He slows right down to a light jog and says, "Evening," as he jogs past me. I ask my mom to stay on the line. Her BF comes out to meet me at the top of the hill. The guy is nowhere to be seen. He was definitely running up behind me to strike me, and by turning to face him, I'm certain it threw him off. Story 7. I used to work as a shot girl at a pub, which meant long nights, lots of noise, and dealing with all kinds of people. Most of the time, it was pretty routine, pouring shots, chatting with customers, and brushing off the occasional drunk guy who thought buying a drink entitled him to my number. It came with the territory, and you learn pretty quickly how to handle it without making a big deal out of things. One night, toward the end of my shift, this guy came up and tried to chat me up. He wasn't aggressive or pushy, just one of those typical, slightly tipsy guys who thought he had a shot. He asked for my number, and I politely turned him down. He took it well enough, shrugged it off, and went back to his group. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was one of those interactions I'd had 100 times before, and it didn't set off any alarms for me. The night carried on, and eventually the pub closed. We did the usual end-of-night cleanup, wiping down the counters, stacking chairs, and clearing out the last few stragglers who didn't want to leave. By the time we were done, it was the early hours of the morning, and I was ready to head home. Normally, I'd leave through the back door into the car park where my car was. It was quicker and quieter than going through the front, and I'd done it dozens of times without a second thought. But that night, as I approached the back door, something felt off. The sensor light outside had been triggered, and it was casting this bright, artificial glow into the otherwise dark alley. At first, I figured it was probably just a cat or maybe one of the other staff grabbing something from their car. But then I saw him. A man, standing just outside the door, barely visible through the frosted glass panel. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel the tension rolling off him even through the glass. I didn't know why, but everything in me screamed not to open that door. My instincts were practically shouting at me to get out of there. So instead of stepping outside, I turned around and walked back through the pub to the front entrance. I spotted one of the bouncers who was still there, finishing up his shift, and asked him to walk me around to my car. The second we rounded the corner to the back, the hair on my neck stood up. There he was, the guy I'd turned down earlier, lurking right outside the door. And worse, he wasn't just standing there anymore. He was holding his belt, stretched out between his hands, like some kind of makeshift garrote. I froze for half a second, but the bouncer didn't. He stepped forward, all business, and the guy immediately lost it. He started screaming at me, calling me every name under the sun. Fucking bitch was the one that stuck, and saying I should die. His voice was wild, unhinged, like something had snapped inside him. Then, just as suddenly as it started, he turned and bolted into the road. I don't know if he realized he'd been caught red-handed or if he just panicked when he saw the bouncer, but he was gone before we could do anything. We stood there for a minute, making sure he wasn't coming back, and then the bouncer walked me to my car and waited until I drove off. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying it in my head, thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my gut. What if I'd just opened that door like I usually did? What if I hadn't asked the bouncer to walk me out? I didn't even want to let myself go too far down that road, because it was terrifying to think about. The worst part was how normal the whole night had felt until then. That's what stuck with me the most, how easy it is to let your guard down when everything seems fine. That guy hadn't given me any reason to worry earlier. He wasn't aggressive, didn't seem angry, and acted like he took the rejection in stride. And yet, there he was a couple of hours later, waiting outside with a weapon, ready to do. I don't even want to finish that sentence. Story 8. Someone came into my work that gave me the I'm in danger feeling. I work in a place where 60% of my customers are children, and I naturally get very protective of them, but you can't call the police because someone's creeping you out. He kept getting close to children, but not doing anything or even making them uncomfortable, so there still wasn't anything I could do. He leaves and I shrug it off. Another customer soon comes in and gives me the same feeling, so I'm thinking I'm just anxious today. He's talking about Donkey Kong and stuff, casual conversation. Then he says I'm best friends with Martin Bryant, the spree killer from the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, who is in solitary confinement and can't even interact with whoever has to throw his food at him. So I'm getting a bit nervous now. Then the first creepy guy comes in, and the one I was talking to says, I know him, we went to prison together. So immediately I start having a panic attack and have to end the conversation as quick as possible, so I can contact the manager to say I need someone else to come into the store. I was there alone, and they immediately call the police. Turns out they were both registered sex offenders. Neither were allowed anywhere near my work because it's too close to the CBD, and they're legally now allowed near anywhere that could have children there. I actually recently went to court for this, waited hours to go in, and he pleaded guilty at the very last second. Bastard. Story 9. I'm a type 1 diabetic with gastroparesis and chronic vomiting disorder. When I get sick, I get really sick. Back in early January, I got a stomach bug from my daughter. After not being able to hold down even water for a few hours, and my blood sugars spiking upwards with insulin, not even touching them my partner, and I Ubered to the closest hospital. I was given 4 fluids and antiemetics plus 4 insulin for a few hours, and then told that had gotten me through the peak of my illness and sent me home. As soon as I got home and the meds wore off, I was back in the exact same spot. So 3 days later we go back to the ER. Exact same song and dance. As the doc was telling me she was going to send me home, I was leaning over the side of the bed and puking into a bag my partner was holding. She had to raise her voice to be heard above my retching to tell me, I think you're fine and I'm sending you home. I begged her to keep me longer for treatment. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that and felt unsafe going home like that. She basically told me that was too bad and that they needed the ER bay for someone with an emergency and not the tummy flu. I don't actually remember much after that. I remember going home and asking my partner to kill me because it hurt so bad and no one would help me. I remember paramedics in my house. I remember being in emergency and suddenly not being able to breathe after 9 failed attempts to get in 4 into my dehydrated veins. Then I just remember my partner saying, this is too much, I need to call your mom. I'm sorry, and then I woke up 2 days later in the ICU. So I guess after we got home from the second ER visit, I was still uncontrollably vomiting and heaving. My blood sugar wouldn't budge a single mole. So was wetting down my hair with washcloths in bed while I was puking into a giant mixing bowl. He says he went to empty it for me and noticed solid pieces in the stomach bile and had a terrible feeling about it. I hadn't eaten anything or even had more than a few sips of water for the past week. There shouldn't have been anything solid. So he ended up calling 911 for me. When the paramedics got there, they said I was so sick they would have to take me to the closest hospital, the same one that kept sending me home. So he lied to the EMTs, told them my endocrinologist was at a different hospital, so they'd have to take me there. He saved my life that night, without question. My body had gone into complete DKA and was starting to eat my internal organs for energy. The solid bits in my puke. Pieces of my stomach lining, apparently. If it wasn't for him, I would have stayed home that night and most likely died in my sleep. His gut feeling told him I needed help, and he was right. Story 10. Not me but my dad. I was too stupid to listen to him. I used to live on the roughest council estate in my hometown when I was very young. Very dangerous for anyone, let alone kids. So for that reason my parents rarely let me outside unless I was with other kids being supervised or within sight of my parents. This story is regarding the latter one. I wanted to go to the nearby park, but my dad said no as there were some rough people over there, and that I could only play outside on the steps to our flat building, which I agreed to, although I had no intention of doing that, lol. As soon as I went outside, I went right to the park and began playing. I kept glancing over at the 2 people and noticed them constantly looking over at me, which made me nervous, but I was like 5 years old, so cared more about fun than my own safety. Anyway, the 2 people approached me, they'd been drinking, and cornered me by a fence when I tried to run. They grabbed a hold of me, when out of nowhere I heard my dad shouting at them. He ran over, and it's the only time I ever saw him get physical with anybody, but he handed their asses to them while screaming obscenities at them for putting their hands on his son. He grabbed a hold of my arm and dragged me back home, all while swearing at me for being so stupid. I got a good hiding over that and was grounded for weeks. Years later I asked him about it, and he told me that he just knew that I would go to the park, so followed me to keep an eye on me. He didn't expect anything to happen to me, but when it did he went mental. Story 11. This happened about 12 years ago. There were missing women in the area, but the city I lived in was big in adult entertainment, and the workers typically have a transient lifestyle, so we weren't sure if it was just rumors. I should also mention this is a border town. Anyways, I went out for a meal with co-workers after shutting the bar down. This was around the time a smoking bylaw came into effect, and you could no longer smoke under awnings. After I finished eating, I went out for a smoke by myself. It is about 3 a.m. at this point. The awning ended adjacent to the parking lot, and there was a car with out-of-country plates on it from across the border. The restaurant was also a motel, so there was a second story where there were rooms. As I'm smoking, this creepy guy from inside follows me out. It was winter, and he was sitting at the bar alone drinking a milkshake. Not weird in and of itself, but something was off about him. He begins to approach me, making unwavering eye contact, and starts saying really weird stuff. I figured since I was getting the cold shoulder inside, I should come stand out in the cold. This was 12 years ago, so I can't remember much detail on what he was saying, but every hair on my body stood up. I knew something was really wrong. And as he reached into his pockets and continued walking towards me, I became acutely aware of how close I was to what I now guessed was this man's car. He wasn't large or physically imposing, but I couldn't see his hands, and something about how he looked at me, it was like looking into the eyes of a predator. Cliché, I know, but I had no doubt he was planning on abducting me. I just knew. It was a primal sense of, I have to do something. My back is against the wall, his car and the empty parking lot to my right, and this creep edging closer and closer, blocking my path into the restaurant door, which is about 70 feet away across the patio. He is no longer speaking, and is approaching, almost within arm's reach. I knew I had to fight him, or I would end up in his trunk. Seconds before I'm about to kick him in the balls, you could hear the footsteps of someone coming down the steps from the hotel. At that exact moment, he took a giant step back and took his hands out of his pockets. It confirmed every horrible suspicion I had. An innocent person wouldn't react that way. I flicked my smoke and ran inside. A bunch of bouncers from the bar were eating, and I told them as quickly as I could what happened. Within the 20 seconds it took to explain, the man and his car were gone. To this day, I know if that person didn't come down those stairs at that exact moment, he likely would have tasered me and put me in the truck of his car. Story 12. Not me but my sister. I wish it had saved my sister, but here we go. TLDR at the end. My sister had been going through a rough patch of alcoholism and a looming divorce, already separated. She brought a guy home she had met at a gas station where she was having trouble pumping her gas. He offered to help her, got her number, etc. When she brought him home, I got defensive and every single nerve was on high alert. I asked him how he knew my sister and what he was doing here. He didn't answer immediately. We sat down in the kitchen where he sat next to me. I was battling the nausea and adrenaline rush when he reached and puts his hand on my thigh and asks if I'm scared of him because he's black. Side note, my sister and brother are both adopted from Africa, so they're black. I told him no, and to not touch me. He then reaches for my arm, and I pull away, clearly uncomfortable. I tell him I'm going to watch TV, and go sit on the couch. After 4 months of my sister dating him moving in, my sister paying for a new car in her name for him, multiple expensive purchases, smoking in the house, leasing an apartment for him, and being antisocial in general during family get-togethers, Christmas and New Year's, my sister starts coming home with burns and bruises. She's traumatized and hurting. She also chose this time to start detoxing. She was in a pattern of drinking heavily to numb the pain, drinking to escape, being beaten and raped, and detoxing. My sister and he go to Vegas where they're in a nice hotel on the Strip. Radio silence for 3 days, then my ex-brother-in-law calls my mom and tells her to get ready for my sister. The boyfriend had taken her to Vegas, beaten her, raped her, choked her out to the point of losing consciousness, and she was in a position where she couldn't move if she wanted to. My mother cared for my sister for a week while she couldn't get up to bathe, couldn't eat, had massive bruising everywhere, and was reliving the trauma. 6 months after she brought him home, My sister's coworker has run a background check and done some digging. This guy has multiple molestation counts, multiple counts of predatory stalking, and some small robbery charges. My sister goes to rehab for a couple months, tries to lose him, and a couple weeks after this, an officer comes and asks my sister to identify a body. A female. We don't have any information other than she was associating with the boyfriend. Everyone is thinking the same thing, he killed her. As a happy ending, my sister went to an intensive rehab in a city 3 hours away, lost the guy, and she is now sober for 3 or 4 months. Unfortunately, she has PTSD, anxiety attacks, and she is paranoid. She cannot be home alone or she freaks out. Story 13. It was Christmas Day. I'm driving to my parents at 6 a.m. It's extremely dark out when I see a horrible accident in front of me taking up the 2 right lanes. Both vehicles don't have their hazard lights on. I pull in front of them, switch my hazard lights on, and get out of my car on the freeway hoping I can help them and make sure they're okay. I'm walking toward the first driver, 1819, who has blood all over him. He asks me to help him talk to 911 because he spoke broken English. Then I go to the second driver, 60s, and see if he's okay, who just blames me for the accident. I just responded I didn't do it. The operator then tells me to get everyone on the side of the freeway, which is only 2 to 3 feet from the slowest lane. Suddenly I have this gut feeling to look to my left, and as I do, I see a SUV racing toward us, and I suddenly realize he's not going to stop, and he's about to hit the first vehicle. The rest happened within a few seconds. The only thing I can think of is get out of the way, and the only way was to go backwards. At the time I didn't know, but there was an overpass behind us. As I'm about to fully fall back, I bothered to look where I was falling, and saw how far the drop was. I reasoned I was either going to get hit by the SUV, or be crippled from the fall, and get hit by a car below me. Fat nope from my part, I hurled myself back up, and as I'm doing so, I watched the SUV hit my leg. The only thing I'm thinking is, relax, relax, relax. I came out with no injuries, and the young man wasn't hit. Unfortunately, the older man next to me was hit, and killed on impact. After hitting the man, the guy in the SUV, 65 plus, hit my car and then swerved through all 5 lanes of traffic and crashed into the center divider. He stayed in his car for a while, and when he tried to get out, he was frantic and tried to cross all 5 lanes while cars were going by. I screamed and told him please not to cross. The guy that was hit was knocked like 100 feet from where we were standing, past where my car was parked. His shoes, socks, money, everything was scattered across the freeway. The worst part of witnessing it was the skid marks of his blood on the freeway, and his brain matter was in one little pile. All this was happening while I was still on the phone with 911. The operator asked me what happened, and asked me if I could drag his body off the freeway. I couldn't do it. I was afraid someone else might not see the accident, hit my car, and then me. It's been over a year since the accident, and the police report isn't out yet. The guy in the SUV has insurance and a lawyer though. After the accident, a CHP told me that he's seen accidents like this where the Good Samaritan was killed trying to help. Take away from this, do not get out of your vehicle on the freeway. Story 14. Sunset Highway, mile marker 5, Seaside, Oregon. When I was 16, my dad took me deep-sea fishing in Owako, Washington. We left our house in Portland, stupid early in the morning, 2 a.m., to get to the dock in time to depart by 4:30 a.m. We had a fun day out, caught loads of fish, and were on the road driving home in the early afternoon. I fell asleep about 30 minutes into our drive. I remember waking up, my dad singing to the radio, eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. My heart is pounding, and then totally clearly I hear in my head, tell your dad to put his seatbelt on. I distinctly remember feeling teen embarrassment and mentally voicing, what the heck? No way, I'm not going to tell my dad what to do. After a couple minutes, and more of my dad serenading me to some Willie Nelson song, I hear the voice again, this time very directly, tell your dad to put his seatbelt on, and tell him right now. I begrudgingly oblige and say, Dad, you should probably put your seatbelt on. He says, oh shoot, thanks, silly that I even need the reminder, and he buckles up and goes on singing and munching on his PBJ. I smile, my heartbeat settles down, I close my eyes and lean my head against the window and promptly fall asleep. The next time I open my eyes, I'm staring at the coins that were resting on the dashboard, now floating in slow motion in front of me. I see my hands are outstretched, and for some reason they make contact with the windshield. Sunshine is flashing like a strobe light, refracting off thousands of tiny chunks of glass, but also, there's dirt. Why is there dirt floating in the air in our car? I'm very confused. My hearing comes crashing back as this memory shifts to real time, and I can hear my dad yelling for me, the engine whining, and the screech of bending metal, the crunch of breaking glass. I can smell the dirt, the engine oil rubber. It dawns on me we've been rolling. We finally come to a stop, and we're tipped sideways, with the driver's side up in the air. I'm disoriented, but somehow coherent. My dad is in shock and confused, asking where I am. I'm able to unbuckle myself and crawl out through the now missing windshield, and after a bit of a wrestle, I help my dad get unbuckled even though all his weight is on his seatbelt buckle. He's bleeding pretty badly on his arm, but he says he's fine as we both scamper up the hill to the road. Traffic has stopped, and there's now a crowd of people who gasp as we make it up roadside. We watched it all happen in slow motion. We just knew there wouldn't be survivors. Multiple people tell us. You need to sit down, you're not looking good. One man tells me. I feel fine, but my ears are ringing, and my right ear is bloody to the touch. My dad is really dazed and keeps asking for me even though I'm sitting right next to him, telling him I'm fine, and I'm right here. It starts to dawn on me how crazy this all is as I look down and see just how far we climbed up to the road. We must have rolled 5 times after flying off the road at 60 miles per hour. Onlookers said we hit a tree not long after we departed the road, which slowed us down, but sent us rolling toward the small river below. First responders arrive. They're all in disbelief we walked away. As we're being lifted into the ambulance, my dad says to the firefighter who had bandaged his arm, "Please, somewhere down there's a cooler full of fresh salmon. It's all yours. I'd hate to see it go to waste." I always wondered if they actually went looking for it, and if they have a shared memory of remember that time that father and son bailed off the road and gave us their salmon? That was the best barbecue ever. We were whisked off to the hospital to get checked out. "You are unbelievably lucky," the paramedics kept telling us. "It's not called the bloody highway for nothing," says his partner. At the ER, one of them pulled my dad aside and said, "When you go to collect your things from the tow yard, you may experience some pretty intense emotions seeing the vehicle." Despite this warning, we were totally unprepared for the flood of emotions while walking up to our mangled, shredded. The cabin roof was totally peeled open, Ford Ranger pickup. My dad and I often reflect back on this and make the occasional pilgrimage to Owako. He thanks me at least once a year for listening to that voice, and my kids regularly ask for a retelling of that time you saved your dad's life. And I tell it again and again. And I tell them I'm grateful teen embarrassment lost that battle, so they can grow up knowing my old man. Story 15. When I was in the army, we spent 3 weeks in Panama for jungle training. The terrain down there is a nightmare, nothing but steep hills. You try to stick to the ridges if you can, but unfortunately they rarely run in the direction you're traveling. On our last day in the field, we were moving to set up an ambush when we came to the ridge of a hill, roughly 200 m from top to bottom, with about a 45-degree slope. We really should have rappelled down it, but we lacked the rope to do it properly. Instead, we start carefully picking our way down the hill, while carrying about 65 pounds of gear. About halfway down the hill, I slipped. Had that frantic moment where my arms are pinwheeling while I'm trying to catch my balance, but luckily I stumbled against this spindly little sapling of a tree, just a couple of feet tall. It was just barely big enough to stop my slide and let me regain my balance. While I'm doing that, I hear a guy at the top of the hill yell "rock," meaning he's just kicked a rock loose and it's now tumbling down the hill. I look back but don't see anything, so I shrugged and turned back to continue my journey down the hill. Okay, so this is the weird part. Even to this day I can't explain it. I'll just tell it the way I remember it, and let you draw your own conclusions. As I'm preparing to head down the hill, I swear I heard a little voice in the back of my head. You might just want to take another look up that hill. Okay. So I turned to take another look, and this time I spotted the rock. It was about the size of a bowling ball, moving at a pretty good clip, and it must have just hit something and bounced, because when I spotted it, the rock was about 2 feet from my face, and zooming in for the kill. I think I reacted the way most people would. I screamed "SHIT," and tried to dive out of the way. I almost made it. Smiley face. Damn thing clipped my elbow and threw me straight back, and the only thing that stopped me was that same little spindly sapling I'd bumped into the first time. I thought I'd shattered my elbow, and I'm hollering like a stuck pig, but thankfully I was only badly bruised. Thing is, if I hadn't turned around for another look, that rock would have either snapped my neck or thrown me down the hill to let gravity do the work. Either way, that little voice probably saved my life. And like I said, I still can't explain it. Story 16. I decided to waste time before heading home since I skipped out on work at the time and went to a plaza near where I used to work. I stopped at a couple stores before hitting a party city. It was near Halloween time, so I wanted to see what they had out. But mind you, the area I was in was completely unsafe. It was known for a bit of human trafficking activity. I'm a 20-year-old female who is 5 feet 0 inches and weighs about 110 pounds. I'm quite small, but I thought I'd be okay just checking the store out because the other two I went to were fine and I didn't get any weird vibes from them. So I parked my car at the end of the parking lot in front of the store, closest to the road. It was all I could get. I went in and just started to look around. There was a couple families, so I felt fine. Up until I went down an aisle near the front and saw a man on the phone who was looking very uninterested at the thing he was gazing at with another lady. He glanced at me and wouldn't stop looking at me. He spoke Spanish, so I couldn't make out what he was saying since my Spanish is pretty limited despite living in Arizona for so long. I started to feel uneasy, so I went toward the back into the next aisle, thinking my mind was just in overdrive since I was supposed to be at work, and that's where my parents thought I was. I finished looking down the aisle, and once I got to the back, the same lady that was with the man was already standing back there, as if she was waiting for me. I smiled at her and nodded in my head, as I do in respect when I make eye contact with someone. I thought it would be a good way to show her that I've seen her face enough to know what she looks like. So I went back down the aisle again and saw the man standing to the side near the front. I noticed a lady finishing checking out and rushed over behind her. The moment she walked out, I did too, and I hauled ass to my car and quickly started to drive away towards the freeway. I really felt uncomfortable, and I thought maybe I was being overdramatic. But the only reason I knew about the activity there was because a couple weeks after the incident, there were reports of a few areas in Phoenix regarding human trafficking, and that area was one of them. Story 16. I was driving a friend home late at night when I was around 21. She lived in a pretty rural area outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and about a quarter mile from her house was an old abandoned farm and farmhouse. I always thought of this place as non-threatening, as she told me she and her 2 sisters would go there as kids, and they found an attic full of cool things, including a trunk of vintage woman's clothing and old love letters. Like something out of a movie. Anyway, I'm driving her home, and it's a hot, humid Missouri summer, and we have the windows open as the late night had offered some cool air. We're also singing at the top of our lungs. We pass the abandoned farm, and I drop her off at her house. I wait long enough to see she makes it inside, and I head back out the way I came. I'm driving along and I get to almost where the farm is, and I see 2 things in the road. My danger meter goes off as I had just driven this road, and there was nothing there. I put the windows up and make sure the doors are locked. I get closer and I realize the items are 2 car batteries spaced out in the road, which was basically a 1-lane road, in a way that I would have to get out and move them to drive on the road. I immediately knew I wasn't getting out of the car, so I picked the side of the road that had the lesser ditch and I gunned it. I was driving a little SUV and remember feeling the car run over branches and things in the little ditch, but I just gunned it and got out of there. All the way home I felt creeped out and kept checking my rearview mirror. I called my friend the next morning and told her what had happened, and we both agreed it was weird. Shortly after that I moved to another state and didn't think much of it after that. Fast forward to 2 to 3 years later when I was back visiting my hometown. I randomly ran into my old friend, and she ran up to me with wide eyes and grabbed my arms. She asked me if I remembered what I told her that night. I said yes, and she proceeded to tell me that not too long after that had happened her family was awakened in the middle of the night to someone pounding on their sliding glass door. Her dad went to check and saw 2 naked, injured women and let them in and called 911. They had been abducted from St. Louis City, about 40 minutes away, by 2 men and brought to the old, abandoned farmhouse where the men tortured and raped them. The women somehow managed to get free and ran to the only light they could see, the light over my friend's garage. They survived, but the men were never caught. There was evidence the men had been going there for a while. My friend was convinced they had put the batteries in the road to lure me out of the car. I'm just really glad my gut told me not to.